The story kicks off with the sun acting wrong. It's 2009, and something up there is punching harder than it ever has. Violent eruptions rippling through the solar atmosphere like the star itself is getting angry. Most people are clueless, living normal lives under an ordinary sky, but one scientist can't ignore the numbers. Dr. Adrian Helmsley sees the data, feels that cold twist in his stomach, and immediately does what serious people do when the math stops making sense. He gets on a plane. His destination is India, where he meets with astrophysicist Satnam, one of the few minds on Earth who won't shrug this off as another anomaly. Satnam doesn't greet him with theories. He takes him underground. Not metaphorically, literally. They descend into a copper mine so deep it feels like traveling into the planet's throat. Down, down, down until daylight is a memory. In a makeshift lab carved into the rock, Satnam lays it out. The sun's outbursts aren't just record-breaking. They're cooking the Earth from the inside. And he doesn't prove it with charts alone. He shows Helmsley boiling groundwater sealed in a tank, heat that has no business being there. Helmsley's face says what words can't. If the Earth's core is being pushed past its limits, the crust won't behave like crust anymore. And once the crust stops behaving, cities become sandcastles. He bolts back to the United States and barges into a high-profile event, cutting through the politics and champagne to reach Carl Anheuser, an icy, calculating power broker sitting at the top of the presidential administration. Helmsley doesn't dress it up. He doesn't soften it. He tells him the planet is building toward a catastrophic failure. What happens next is the quiet kind of panic, the kind the public never sees. 6 months later, in 2010, President Thomas Wilson gathers the leaders of the world's most powerful nations and delivers the briefing they never wanted. The end isn't a distant possibility. It's a date on a calendar with teeth. And the world's governments do what they always do in a crisis that can't be managed in public. They bury it. No press conferences, no warnings, no evacuation drills. The truth stays locked behind closed doors while the people in those rooms start doing the only thing they can think of, buying time for themselves. Far away from cameras, in a remote Tibetan valley, a colossal project comes alive, massive ark-like ships, engineered to survive a planet-scale flood and the collapse of civilization. The workforce is told it's a dam, a practical infrastructure build, something patriotic, something temporary, but the rules are strange. Workers who can't keep up are removed. Families vanish from the camps overnight. Only specialized skills are allowed to remain. It's a construction site with the vibe of a prison and the silence of a lie. By 2011, the lie has a price tag. Seats on the Ark's limited, secret, priceless, are quietly offered to the world's ultra-elite. The numbers are obscene, about €1 billion per spot, a human life reduced to a transaction, reserved for those who can afford to outbid fate. Even culture isn't spared. In Paris, Wilson's daughter Laura works with an art preservation initiative that she believes is about protecting history in unstable times. She's told to help remove priceless works, including a certain famous painting, swapping originals with decoys to keep them safe from chaos. She thinks she's serving humanity. She doesn't realize she's helping to curate a museum for the survivors. Then 2012 arrives, and the world begins to feel the pressure it's been denied. News programs start talking about the Mayan calendar, doomsday theories, and strange underground chatter. People who don't know the science still sense the dread. Some spiral into mass panic, some into cultish certainty, and some into despair so deep it becomes contagious. Meanwhile, California starts cracking like old paint. A fissure here, a tremor there. People shrug it off, blame it on minor quakes, and keep buying groceries. At the harbor, a cruise ship settles oddly in the water and passengers exchange nervous jokes, because joking is what humans do right before something terrifying proves them wrong. Laura, on the other hand, gets a phone call that turns her blood to ice. The museum director in Paris, one of the people helping her move the artwork, admits something doesn't add up. He's realized the operation isn't what they were told. He intends to speak publicly and tell the world what's really happening. He doesn't get the chance. His car explodes without warning, snuffing him out mid-sentence, mid-confession. And suddenly Laura's charity work feels less like preservation and more like complicity. Back in Washington, Helmsley and Anheuser deliver the update every leader fears. Their timeline was wrong. Everything is accelerating. The planet isn't drifting toward disaster anymore, it's sprinting. Laura storms into the White House looking for answers, and for once the truth can't be dodged. Wilson tells her. The arcs, the cover-up, the selection process, all of it. Somewhere else entirely, a divorced father named Jackson Curtis is trying to do something far more ordinary, be a good dad. He takes his kids on a trip to Yellowstone, hoping a few days in nature will patch up the pieces life keeps tearing. But Yellowstone doesn't feel like a vacation spot anymore. There are helicopters slicing through the sky, fenced-off zones, warning signs, the kind of security you don't see around tourist attractions. Jackson ignores the barriers because people always assume rules are for someone else, and the family climbs into restricted territory. What they find is wrong in a way that makes your skin crawl. A lake bed that should be full of water is bone dry. Dead animals lie scattered like the land itself has been drained of mercy. It's not just drought, it feels unnatural. From the tree line, a strange man watches them, Charlie Frost, a jittery, paranoid outsider who looks like he's been waiting for this moment his whole life. The military doesn't appreciate Jackson's curiosity. Soldiers sweep in, detain the family, and haul them to a base where Helmsley happens to be present. Helmsley tries to keep it calm, explaining, carefully, that the area is unstable and the best thing Jackson can do is take his children away. Jackson leaves unsettled with that nagging sense that he just brushed up against something enormous. That night, he runs into Charlie at a campsite, an eccentric doomsday broadcaster living out of a van, transmitting late-night rants to anyone willing to listen. Charlie is the kind of guy most people laugh at, right up until the sky starts falling. Jackson overhears the broadcast, confronts him, and gets a rapid-fire flood of apocalyptic claims, ancient prophecies, government secrets, and a looming catastrophe the world refuses to see. It sounds ridiculous until Charlie shows Jackson clippings, headlines, suspicious deaths, people who tried to talk and didn't live long afterward. Then Charlie mentions a name that hits closer than Jackson expects. A professor Jackson once worked with, recently dead. Charlie claims the professor sent him a map, coordinates tied to some kind of government evacuation plan. Jackson walks away unconvinced, but he doesn't sleep well. And the next morning, the ground makes the decision for him. In California, the shaking escalates into something monstrous. A supermarket literally tears apart as the earth splits beneath it. It's not a single quake. It's the beginning of the crust unraveling. Jackson's ex-wife Kate calls in a panic, demanding the kids come home immediately. Jackson looks out at the world and realizes Charlie wasn't crazy. He was early. Around the same time, Anheuser reports grim numbers to the president. Only 4 arcs are ready. 4, not enough to save even a fraction of the people who deserve saving. And in another high-level gathering, Helmsley explains that the window has shrunk to days, maybe less. The evacuation plan is triggered, not for everyone, for the chosen. Jackson, meanwhile, gets a call from his wealthy employer, Yuri Karpov, an oligarch with resources, connections, and a private escape route. Karpov orders Jackson to bring his twin sons to the airport immediately. One of the boys casually mentions something chilling, that he won't be around much longer, but he'll still get to leave on a giant ship. Jackson's throat goes tight. Giant ship, he doesn't wait for more. He rents a small aircraft, bolts back to Los Angeles, and races to collect what matters: his kids, Kate, and unfortunately, Kate's new boyfriend, Gordon. And that's when California truly breaks. Houses fold like cardboard, roads buckle into impossible angles, entire blocks drop into the earth as if someone pulled a trapdoor beneath the city. Jackson drives like a man possessed, swerving around sinkholes, jumping broken pavement, cutting through yards and trees as the world collapses behind him. Downtown turns into a death trap. Skyscrapers shear apart, bridges collapse. A city built on confidence becomes a graveyard in minutes. They reach the airport just as it, too, begins to die. The pilot Jackson hired is gone. Gordon, who has only basic flying experience, ends up in the cockpit, sweating through terror, gripping the controls like prayer might hold the wings together. Somehow, he lifts them off the ground right before the runway fractures and the whole area is swallowed. From above, they watch the coastline drown. Water surges inward. Los Angeles is erased. Jackson remembers Charlie's map, and the family detours back toward Yellowstone to find him. They locate his van, empty. Charlie has climbed to a high point, choosing to broadcast to the end rather than run. Jackson tries to convince him, but Charlie stays behind, speaking into the void as the earth convulses and the volcanic system awakens. The sky fills with ash and fire. The explosion is biblical. Charlie disappears under falling debris, still clinging to his last message. Jackson barely escapes, barely retrieves the map, barely gets airborne again as the ground breaks like a shattered plate beneath them. Now the map points east. To China, back in the halls of power, the world is burning on every screen. Cities fall, landmarks crumble, death counts spiral beyond comprehension. Helmsley argues that the public deserves to know, that humans should at least face the end with honesty. Anheuser shuts him down. His logic is brutal. Telling everyone now would mean riots, chaos, and the potential collapse of the Ark operation. He wants the selected safely aboard before the truth detonates. President Wilson, faced with the moment every leader secretly imagines, chooses something rare. He refuses to abandon his people. He stays behind, even as Anheuser effectively takes control and departs with Helmsley and Laura. Laura gets one last goodbye from her father before the connection, and the world falls silent. Wilson finally makes the announcement to the public, telling everyone the truth when it's almost too late for truth to matter. Meanwhile, Jackson's group lands in Las Vegas, where the airspace is locked down and panic is spilling through the streets. Karpov is there with his family, his girlfriend Tamara, and even her tiny dog, because when the world ends, the wealthy still cling to comforts. Jackson begs for help. Karpov initially brushes him off, until his pilot Sasha locates a massive transport plane and admits he'll need a co-pilot to get it off the ground. Gordon steps forward. It's the first time the guy seems truly useful. They take off illegally, dodging collapsing buildings, skimming past danger by inches, and punching into the sky like they've stolen a miracle. Over Hawaii, they see a nightmare. The island's consumed by lava, structures wiped out, the land glowing with molten destruction. The planet is reshaping itself, and then fuel runs low. The plane limps toward what should be ocean, except the ocean isn't where it belongs anymore. Continents have shifted. The world map has been rewritten in real time. Instead of water, they find mountains, Himalayan ridges looming like walls. Sasha makes the call, they're landing, but landing isn't really the word. It's more like surviving impact. With engines failing, he orders everyone into vehicles inside the cargo hold. The rear opens. Cars slide out into snow and chaos. One vehicle carries Jackson's family, and they manage a brutal skidding descent that ends in one piece. Others aren't so lucky. Sasha wrestles the aircraft down, but the plane slides, snaps, and plunges off a cliff, exploding in a fireball that disappears into the storm. Sasha is gone. Not long after, helicopters thunder overhead, Chinese cargo flights ferrying animals toward the Ark site. Soldiers land, assessing survivors with cold efficiency. Tickets only. Karpov, clutching his wealth-born entitlement, is taken. Tamara is abandoned without hesitation, punished for betrayal, discarded like luggage. The dog somehow remains a point of contention because even during apocalypse, people still fight over love in small forms. Jackson's group is left behind. They trek through the snow until they spot a truck and force it to stop. The driver is Nima, a young monk with urgent purpose. He's fleeing his monastery to rescue his elderly grandparents after learning the truth from his brother Tenzin, who works on the Ark project. Nima chooses compassion over rules and takes them with him. As they arrive near the Ark facility, the scale of the operation hits like a punch. Massive ships rest in a hidden valley. Crowds of VIPs gather, royalty, dignitaries, billionaires, some accompanied by pets and luxury, as if they're boarding a cruise instead of a lifeboat. But cracks run through this plan too. One Ark has been damaged, repairs lag. And the cruelty of the selection process becomes unmistakable. People with no practical value have seats, while the workers who built Salvation aren't even considered worthy of it. Helmsley is sickened by what he sees. A cabin designed to hold many is reserved for a few, because comfort has been prioritized over lives. Then Helmsley receives a call that shatters him completely. Satnam, trapped, abandoned, waiting for rescue that never arrives, says goodbye as the wall of water closes in. Helmsley can do nothing but listen, helpless, as one of the best men on Earth is erased along with his family. Now the countdown is minutes. The wave is coming. Outside the gates, Jackson's group reaches the entrance with Nima and his grandparents. Tenzin appears torn between duty and compassion, and initially refuses anyone not authorized. Kate pleads. The grandmother scolds her grandson with the force of a lifetime's morality. Tenzin relents. They slip into the facility just as chaos erupts outside. With one Ark failing, passengers realize they're being left to die. A riot explodes. Karpov uses violence to push through, and suddenly the crowd surges toward the nearest Ark, desperate hands reaching for any opening. People jump, people fall. The gap widens as the ship begins to pull away. Through a safer route, Tenzin leads Jackson's group inside the Ark. Tamara, still stranded, spots her dog with Karpov's children and calls it over. The tiny animal crosses a narrow connection like it's walking a tightrope between worlds, making it inside at the last possible second, while Tamara, with a final gesture of defiance, leaves Karpov to his arrogance. Inside, the moral battle reaches its breaking point. Helmsley watches the tragedy at the gates and can't swallow it anymore. He confronts the international leaders and demands they open the Ark access, arguing that survival without humanity is just a slower kind of death. Anheuser tries to stop him, insisting there isn't time. Helmsley refuses to back down. Laura adds the final pressure, reminding them what President Wilson would have done. The leaders give in. They authorize opening the gates. But even that choice comes with a price. As the Ark's massive mechanisms engage, Jackson's group is caught in the moving machinery. Metal shifts, gears turn, the ship rises. Tenzin and Gordon are knocked into danger. barely clinging to life as the machinery grinds. Jackson fights to pull them back. Tenzin survives, badly injured. Gordon doesn't. The man who helped them fly, who tried to be brave, slips and is swallowed by the gears in a horrifying instant. There's no time to mourn. The arc keeps moving. Worse, Jackson's desperate rescue attempt leaves a cable jammed in the system. The gate can't fully close, and without that, the ship can't depart. Outside, the tsunami arrives like the end of everything. The wave slams into the valley, obliterating workers and structures in seconds. Water pours into the ark through the still-open gate. People scream. Automatic safety systems begin sealing compartments, trapping groups away from each other as flooding spreads. A crashing aircraft smashes into the ark's exterior, knocking it into the neighboring ships. The entire vessel is shoved out of alignment and dragged toward the mountains, toward impact. Helmsley runs through the chaos, finds Jackson's daughter and the dog, and reaches a wall intercom that connects him to Jackson. He guides him to the mechanism that can free the jam, warning him it's deadly. Jackson doesn't hesitate. He dives into freezing, churning water inside the ship's guts, forcing his way into the machinery area like he's wrestling the ark itself. His son follows, helping with a light, refusing to leave his father alone in the dark. Hands numb, metal groans. The ship shudders against rock. Time is gone. Jackson finally yanks the cable free just as the hull slams into a formation hard enough to crack windows. The gate seals. Engines roar. The ark fights the current, reverses at the last moment, and pulls away from the mountain as boulders crash into the water around it. The ship survives by seconds, and the people aboard fall into stunned silence, then shaky relief. Jackson reunites with his family, soaked and exhausted, and for the first time in days, they're not running. Time passes in a world that no longer counts years the old way. History is divided by the flood, by the moment the planet reset itself. Inside the arks, survivors try to become a society again, grieving what they lost while clinging to what remains. Eventually, the storms thin, the sky clears. The sun returns, bright and almost insulting in its calm. People step outside and feel fresh air for the first time since the world drowned. Helmsley checks satellite reports and learns the water is receding. New land has risen, Africa emerging as a higher, safer continent in this reshaped world. And so the arcs turn, not toward the past, toward whatever comes after. Because even after everything, after greed, panic, sacrifice, betrayal, and impossible survival, humanity does what it always does. It keeps going.
Analysis. What if I told you the end of the world wouldn't come quietly? Not with a single explosion, not with a meteor, but with the entire Earth tearing itself apart, skyscrapers folding like paper, highways twisting midair, oceans swallowing continents in seconds. This isn't just another disaster movie. This is 2012, a film that didn't just imagine the apocalypse, it made you feel it. Released at a time when real-world 2012 doomsday theories were spreading like wildfire, this movie tapped directly into global fear. People were genuinely asking, is this how it ends? And then came director Roland Emmerich, Hollywood's king of destruction, and said, let me show you. But here's the twist. Beneath all the collapsing cities and billion-dollar visual effects, this isn't just about the world ending. It's about who survives, who gets left behind, and what really matters when everything else is gone. Because when the ground splits open, when governments fall, when the oceans rise, the only thing that truly counts is the people you're trying to save. In this video, we're not just revisiting the chaos. We're breaking down the story, the symbolism, the hidden details, the ending, and the real reason 2012 became one of the most unforgettable disaster spectacles ever made. So buckle up, because this isn't just the end of the world. It's cinema at its most unapologetically massive. Before we dive into the chaos, let's set the stage. 2012 was released in 2009, right when global anxiety about the Mayan prophecy was at its peak. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more terrifying. Directed by disaster film mastermind Roland Emmerich, the man behind some of cinema's biggest destruction spectacles, this film was designed to go bigger than anything that came before it, and bigger is exactly what it delivered. The movie stars John Cusack as Jackson Curtis, not a soldier, not a scientist, not a superhero, just a regular guy, a struggling writer and divorced father trying to reconnect with his kids. Alongside him, you have Chiwetel Ejiofor playing a scientist racing against time, and Amanda Peet as a mother caught in the middle of global catastrophe. Genre-wise, this is pure disaster sci-fi with heavy action elements, but at its core, it's a survival story. The premise is simple and chilling. Scientists discover that unprecedented solar activity is destabilizing Earth's core. The planet itself is becoming unstable. Earthquakes intensify, volcanoes awaken, tectonic plates begin to shift. And while governments secretly prepare for the worst, billions of ordinary people have no idea what's coming. No aliens, no monsters, no enemy to fight, just nature, completely out of control. And right in the center of it all is one fractured family trying to survive the literal end of the world. No spoilers yet. But what makes 2012 different isn't just the destruction, it's the scale, the ambition, and the terrifying idea that when the planet decides it's done, there's nowhere left to run. Now that you know the setup, let's break down what this movie is really about beneath all the chaos. On the surface, 2012 looks like pure destruction, explosions, earthquakes, entire cities collapsing in seconds. But if you strip away the CG spectacle, what are we really watching? At its core, this is more than a disaster film. It's a survival drama wrapped inside apocalyptic chaos. Directed by Roland Emmerich, a filmmaker known for turning global catastrophe into cinematic art. The movie blends three major genres. First, disaster spectacle. This is the main engine. The scale is global. We're not talking about one city or one country. We're watching the planet itself destabilize. Continents shift. Oceans rise. Civilization collapses. Second, family drama. Right in the middle of all this destruction is a broken family trying to stay alive. A father trying to redeem himself. Children trying to understand what's happening. An ex-couple forced to work together when survival becomes the only priority. And third, political survival thriller. Because here's the uncomfortable question the movie asks. When the world ends, who gets to live? Governments secretly build arcs. Billionaires buy their way onto survival lists. Power, money, and privilege suddenly decide who has a future and who doesn't. That's where the movie becomes more than spectacle. Core theme survival over everything. When extinction is certain, morality gets tested. Redemption, a flawed father trying to prove he can protect his family. Inequality, the elite securing safety while billions are left behind. Rebirth, destruction not as an ending, but as a reset. Emotional tone, the tone swings between relentless chaos and intimate emotional moments. 1 minute you're watching Los Angeles crumble beneath speeding cars. The next, you're watching a father promise his children that everything will be okay, even when he knows it might not be. It's intense, it's dramatic, sometimes even sentimental. And that combination is intentional, because without the human element, all the destruction would feel empty. So while 2012 markets itself as an apocalyptic blockbuster, what keeps audiences invested isn't just the world falling apart. It's the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might survive it. Alright, now it's time to watch the world fall apart. 2012 begins quietly. Scientists discover something terrifying. Intense solar activity is heating Earth's core. At first, it sounds technical, distant, manageable. It's not. The planet's crust is destabilizing. Massive tectonic shifts are coming, not in centuries, in months. Governments around the world panic, but instead of warning the public, they go secret. They launch a covert global survival project, enormous arcs being built in the Himalayas. Humanity's last lifeboats. While world leaders prepare for extinction behind closed doors, ordinary people continue living their lives, unaware that time is running out. Enter Jackson Curtis, a struggling writer and divorced father trying to reconnect with his kids. He's not a hero. He's not a scientist. He's just a dad who stumbles onto the truth. Then it happens. California begins to collapse. The ground splits open. Buildings crumble. Entire neighborhoods sink as Jackson desperately races through a city that's literally tearing itself apart. It's one of the most intense escape sequences ever put on screen. Not because it's subtle, but because it's relentless. And that's just the beginning. Across the globe, disasters multiply, volcanoes erupt, mega earthquakes flatten cities, a massive tsunami engulfs entire coastlines. Civilization collapses in real time. The race shifts toward survival. Jackson and his family must reach China, where the arcs are hidden, before the final crust displacement reshapes the planet permanently. Along the way, we see the contrast, powerful politicians trying to maintain control. Scientists struggling with guilt, billionaires securing their spots on survival lists, and millions of people left without a chance. As the planet's crust shifts, continents sink beneath rising oceans. The final act becomes a desperate fight to board the arcs before a mega tsunami wipes out everything in its path. By the time the waters settle, the world we knew is gone, not damaged, gone. What remains is a handful of survivors floating above a planet that has been completely rewritten. And now, the question isn't how to stop the apocalypse. It's what kind of world will rise from it. So, does humanity survive? At the climax of 2012, the Earth isn't just shaking anymore, it's transforming. The planet's crust shifts in a catastrophic displacement. Entire continents disappear beneath rising oceans. The old world, politically, geographically, historically, is erased in a matter of hours. Inside the massive arcs, chaos erupts, mechanical failures, moral dilemmas, people who weren't supposed to be there. The carefully controlled survival plan almost collapses under its own weight. But here's what matters. At the very last moment, cooperation wins over control. The gates open, more survivors are allowed in. The arcs endure the mega tsunami, and somehow, against impossible odds, they stay afloat. Humanity survives, but not as it was. When the waters finally calm, we learn something powerful. Africa is now the highest remaining landmass. The arcs change course toward it, and that detail isn't random. Symbolically, it's profound. Humanity began in Africa. According to scientific consensus, it's the cradle of civilization, where our earliest ancestors emerged. So after the planet resets itself, humanity returns to its origin. The film doesn't end with despair. It ends with rebirth. The destruction wasn't just an ending, it was a cleansing. A brutal reset. The slate wiped clean. But here's the deeper question the movie leaves us with. Did humanity learn anything? The wealthy bought survival. Governments kept secrets. Millions were left behind. The old world fell because of forces beyond human control. But human inequality remained until the very last second. The final image of ships sailing toward a new continent feels hopeful, almost poetic, yet it carries a quiet warning. If we rebuild the same systems, if we repeat the same mistakes, then what was the point of surviving? 2012 doesn't just show us the end of the world, it shows us a second chance, and the real question isn't whether we would survive. It's whether we would deserve to. On the surface, 2012 looks like pure chaos. Cities collapsing, oceans swallowing continents, humanity running for its life. But beneath all that destruction, there's symbolism layered quietly into the spectacle. And once you notice it, the movie becomes more than just visual noise. Let's break it down. 1. The Mayan calendar. Fear of the unknown. The entire premise is inspired by real-world interpretations of the Mayan calendar ending in 2012. But here's the key. The movie never claims the Mayans predicted doom. Instead, it plays on humanity's obsession with prophecy. We fear what we don't understand, and when a calendar ends, we assume time itself does too. The film uses that cultural anxiety as fuel, not just for the plot, but for atmosphere. It mirrors the real panic that existed before 2012 in our world. In a way, the movie isn't about the Mayans, it's about modern fear. 2000 water is cleansing. Notice how the final act is dominated by water. Tsunamis rise. Continents sink. The world is drowned. Water here isn't random destruction, it symbolizes cleansing. Old systems collapse. Corruption sinks. Inequality gets washed away along with everything else. In mythology and religion, floods often represent rebirth, a reset. And that's exactly what happens. The old world dies in water, so a new one can emerge. 3. Foreshadowing. In the smallest moments early in the film, we see subtle signs, minor tremors, cracks forming in roads, strange environmental instability. These aren't just random effects, they build subconscious tension. Even Jackson's personal life mirrors the planet's instability. His marriage is fractured, his family is divided, the world is breaking, and so is his home. By the time the Earth literally splits open, the emotional groundwork has already been laid. Forge the Ark Project, a quiet political commentary director Roland Emmerich has never been shy about weaving social commentary into large-scale destruction. The Arks represent more than survival. They represent privilege. Tickets are sold for billions. The wealthy secure safety, the powerful decide who lives. It's uncomfortable, and intentionally so, because the film quietly asks, if the world were ending, would survival be fair, or would it be purchased? 5. To Africa. As the new beginning. When the waters settle, Africa becomes the highest surviving landmass. Symbolically, this is powerful. Human civilization began in Africa, and after total extinction-level destruction, humanity returns to its origin. It's a full circle moment. Not just geographically, historically. Here's what makes all of this fascinating. Most viewers remember the collapsing cities, but the deeper message of 2012 isn't about destruction, it's about reset, about tearing down broken systems, about survival forcing humanity to start over, whether it wants to or not. And once you see those layers, the movie transforms from loud spectacle into something a little more thoughtful beneath the noise. Now let's step behind the destruction. Because what happened off-screen during the making of 2012 is almost as massive as what we saw on screen. First, the scale. The film reportedly had a production budget of around $200 million. At the time, that made it one of the most expensive disaster films ever made, and it shows. Entire cities were digitally rebuilt just so they could be destroyed. Los Angeles collapsing? Fully mapped in CG. The mega tsunami swallowing continents, built from scratch using cutting-edge visual effects technology. The visual effects teams pushed rendering technology to its limits in 2009. This wasn't just green screen work. It was large-scale digital simulation that helped redefine what modern disaster films could look like, and audiences responded. The movie went on to earn over $790 million worldwide, proving one thing very clearly: spectacle sells. The director of Destruction, by the time 12 was released, director Roland Emmerich already had a reputation. He had previously delivered large-scale chaos in films like Independence Day and The Day After Tomorrow, but with 2012, he wanted to top himself. Bigger collapses, longer destruction sequences, more global impact. In many ways, this film feels like Emmerich saying, if the world ends, it ends everywhere. Actor commitment: John Cusack performed many physically demanding sequences involving wirework and simulated collapsing environments. While the chaos was digital, the performances had to feel real: panic, fear, urgency. Chiwetel Ejiofor brought emotional weight to the scientific storyline, grounding the over-the-top destruction with sincerity. The cast had to react to environments that didn't exist yet, imagining collapsing skyscrapers while standing in front of green screens. That's not easy. Real-world 2012 panic: here's where it gets even more interesting. When the film was released in 2009, real-world fears about the year 2012 were spreading online. Some people genuinely believed the Mayan calendar predicted global catastrophe. In fact, the marketing campaign leaned into that anxiety. The tagline? Find out the truth. It blurred the line between fiction and conspiracy just enough to spark curiosity and fear. Even NASA had to publicly clarify that no, the world was not ending in 2012. That's the kind of cultural impact this movie had. Fun trivia: the White House destruction shot became one of the most replayed sequences in disaster cinema. The Ark interiors were built as massive practical sets to enhance realism. The film's runtime pushes nearly 2.5 hours, unusually long for a pure disaster spectacle. And yet, despite criticism about excess, 2012 remains one of the defining disaster films of the 21st century. Because it didn't aim small. It aimed for total extinction, and it delivered it in unforgettable fashion. To really understand 12v12, we have to see where it stands among other disaster giants. Because this movie didn't exist in a vacuum. It was competing with some of the biggest, loudest catastrophe films ever made. Let's start with the obvious comparison. The Day After Tomorrow, 2004, also directed by Roland Emmerich. The Day After Tomorrow focused on climate catastrophe, sudden ice ages, superstorms, environmental collapse. That film felt urgent, political, a warning. But 2012, it's less about warning and more about inevitability. You can fight climate change in a movie. You can't fight the planet's crust literally flipping over. In terms of scale, 2012 goes bigger. In terms of emotional focus, it's more chaotic and less grounded. 1996, another Emmerich classic, Independence Day. That movie gave us alien invasions and patriotic speeches. It had a clear enemy, a clear victory. But in 2012, there is no enemy, no villain to defeat. Nature doesn't negotiate. That makes it more helpless, and in some ways, more terrifying. That film focuses on one region, California, and one family's survival during a mega-earthquake. It's grounded, personal, regional. 2012 says, why stop at one state? It destroys the entire planet. If San Andreas is a localized disaster, 2012 is extinction level. What 2012 does better: unmatched global scale, multiple catastrophic events happening simultaneously, a true sense that civilization itself is ending. Very few disaster films attempt total planetary reset. 2012 commits fully. Where it falls short, character depth, sometimes gets sacrificed for spectacle. Scientific explanations, our simplified emotional arcs can feel predictable. Other disaster films might feel tighter, more focused. But none feel this massive. Here's the truth: 2012 isn't trying to be subtle. It's trying to be overwhelming, and compared to its genre rivals, that's exactly what sets it apart. It doesn't ask, how would one city survive? It asks, what if everything ended? And then it actually shows you. When 2012 exploded into theaters, the reaction was divided. On one side, you had audiences walking out stunned. On the other, critics raising eyebrows. Let's break it down. Audience reaction, pure spectacle for many viewers. This movie delivered exactly what it promised: massive destruction, non-stop tension, a front row seat to the end of the world. The scale alone made it worth the ticket price. Watching entire cities collapse on the big screen in 2009 felt groundbreaking. It was loud, dramatic, and unapologetically huge. Audiences embraced that. The box office numbers tell the story, nearly 800 million worldwide. That doesn't happen unless people are showing up in droves. For fans of disaster cinema, this was peak spectacle. Critics' response, style over substance. Critics, however, were more skeptical. Many praised the visual effects and ambition. The destruction sequences were widely recognized as technically impressive. But the common criticisms were hard to ignore. Thin character development, over-the-top coincidences, a runtime that felt stretched, scientific explanations that required generous suspension of disbelief. Some reviewers argued the film relied too heavily on chaos and not enough on emotional depth. In short, they saw it as visually stunning, but narratively shallow. Divisive or misunderstood. Here's the interesting part. 2012 never pretended to be subtle. Director Roland Emmerich is known for large-scale cinematic destruction. From Independence Day to The Day After Tomorrow, his style has always leaned toward spectacle. So the real question becomes, was 2012 overrated, or simply delivering exactly what it promised? Because for many viewers, the emotional core, a father trying to save his family, worked well enough to anchor the chaos. And sometimes, audiences don't want realism. They want experience. They want scale. They want to feel the ground shake in surround sound. Underrated or over the top. Today, 2012 sits in an interesting place in film history. It's often labeled ridiculous, sometimes mocked for its excess, but also remembered, and that's important, because plenty of disaster films fade away. This one didn't. It became a cultural moment, fueled by real-world 2012 fears and unforgettable visuals. So maybe the better word isn't overrated, maybe it's iconic, not because it was subtle. Roland Emmerich has always been one of those filmmakers who instantly splits the room. The moment his name comes up, opinions harden. Some people see him as a master of large-scale spectacle, a director who understands exactly how to turn destruction into entertainment. Others see him as the definition of blockbuster excess, too loud, too chaotic, too dependent on visual mayhem to carry weak storytelling. And honestly, both sides have a point. That tension is a huge part of what makes his career so fascinating. Emmerich doesn't really make restrained films. He doesn't aim for subtle emotional realism or quiet character-driven intimacy. His cinema is built on magnitude. He thinks in collapsing skylines, global panic, giant fireballs, and impossible odds. His movies don't just raise the stakes. They usually vaporize them and build even bigger ones on top of the rubble. For some viewers, that kind of ambition is thrilling. For others, it's exhausting. And that's exactly where a film like 2012 fits into his legacy. It feels like the purest version of both the appeal and the frustration attached to his name. On one hand, it delivers everything audiences expect from Emmerich: worldwide catastrophe, enormous visual effects, and a level of destruction so excessive it almost feels competitive, like the movie is trying to outdo every disaster film that came before it. On the other hand, it also carries the weaknesses that critics have long associated with him: thin characterization, blunt dialogue, melodrama, and a tendency to confuse scale with emotional depth. What makes Emmerich such a divisive filmmaker is that he has never really tried to hide what he is. He knows his brand. He knows audiences come to his films expecting cities to fall and civilization to tremble. He knows spectacle is the product, but the problem is that spectacle alone can only take a movie so far. If the characters don't feel real, if the emotional stakes don't land, if the script feels stitched together purely to get from one collapse to the next, then the whole experience can start to feel hollow no matter how expensive it looks. And yet, there's something almost admirable about how fully he commits to that chaos. Emmerich doesn't flirt with disaster, he dives headfirst into it. He approaches destruction with the confidence of a filmmaker who genuinely believes the sight of the world falling apart can be enough to keep us watching. Sometimes he's right, sometimes he isn't, but he's never timid. That's why even people who don't like his movies often remember them. They may criticize the writing, question the logic, or laugh at the excess, but they rarely forget the scale. That's the strange power of Roland Emmerich. He may not be universally respected, but he is unmistakable. His films feel like events, even when they collapse under their own weight. And 2012 is one of the clearest examples of that. It is a movie that practically dares the audience to make a choice, either surrender to the spectacle and go along for the ride, or resist it and watch the whole thing turn into absurdity. Maybe that's why Emmerich remains such a polarizing figure. He's not a filmmaker people passively respond to. You either buy into the madness or you reject it. You either see grand blockbuster showmanship or you see overblown cinematic chaos. But whichever side you land on, one thing is undeniable. When Roland Emmerich makes a disaster film, he doesn't aim small. He goes after the biggest possible version of destruction, and he does it with such conviction that even his failures become impossible to ignore. That's what makes his reputation so complicated. He's not just a director of disaster movies. He's a director whose entire identity is tied to the thrill and the danger of excess. And if you want to understand 2012, you have to start there, with a filmmaker whose greatest strength and greatest weakness may actually be the exact same thing. Disaster movies have always followed a very recognizable blueprint. Long before modern CGI turned cities into digital dominoes, the genre had already figured out how to keep audiences gripping their seats. The formula was simple but effective. Gather a group of strangers, give each of them a personal conflict, unleash a massive catastrophe, and then let survival, or sacrifice, reveal who they truly are. If you look back at the roots of the genre, you'll find films like San Francisco, Earthquake, and The Poseidon Adventure laying the groundwork decades ago. These movies weren't just about destruction, they were about people trapped inside that destruction. A sinking ship, a collapsing city, a burning skyscraper. The spectacle mattered, but the real hook was watching ordinary characters navigate extraordinary danger. Over time, that formula became almost ritualistic. You always had the ensemble cast, the flawed hero, the estranged family member, the morally upright figure, the cynical authority figure, the comic relief. Each character represented a piece of the human experience. And as the disaster intensified, their personal stories would collide with the larger catastrophe unfolding around them. By the time modern blockbusters arrived, that structure was already deeply ingrained in the DNA of the genre. What changed wasn't the storytelling framework, it was the scale. Instead of one ship sinking or one city collapsing, filmmakers started imagining disasters that threatened the entire planet. That's exactly where a movie like 2012 enters the picture. Rather than reinventing the disaster genre, it takes that familiar formula and amplifies it to extreme proportions. The same ingredients are all there. A fractured family trying to reconnect, scientists racing to understand what's happening, political leaders debating impossible choices, wealthy elites scrambling to secure survival. Every character type you expect from a disaster movie shows up here, just operating within a catastrophe that's no longer local or even national. It's global. The film takes the traditional disaster structure and stretches it across the entire Earth. Instead of one collapsing environment, we get earthquakes ripping continents apart, supervolcanoes erupting, tidal waves swallowing coastlines, and entire cities disintegrating in moments. The stakes aren't just survival anymore, they're extinction. But that expansion also reveals something interesting about the genre itself. Even when the scale becomes enormous, the storytelling doesn't really change. The same emotional beats keep appearing. Estranged parents reconcile. Moral arguments emerge about who deserves to live. Leaders face impossible decisions. Characters who seemed insignificant early on suddenly find themselves in positions where their choices matter. In other words, no matter how big the disaster becomes, the story always returns to people. That's the strange balance disaster films try to maintain. They promise spectacle, giant waves, collapsing buildings, firestorms sweeping across cities, but they still rely on very human stories to hold everything together. Without those personal threads, the destruction becomes empty noise, and that's the tightrope every disaster movie walks. Too much focus on characters, and the spectacle loses momentum. Too much focus on spectacle, and the characters feel like afterthoughts. What makes 2012 such a fascinating entry in the genre is how aggressively it pushes toward the spectacle side of that balance. It embraces the classic disaster movie formula, but it inflates the destruction to such a massive scale that sometimes the human drama struggles to keep up. Yet in many ways, that's also exactly what audiences expect from a disaster film today. The genre has evolved from localized catastrophe into full-blown planetary collapse. What once happened to a single city now happens to the entire world. But beneath all the collapsing landmarks and tidal waves towering over continents, the structure remains surprisingly familiar. A group of people trying to survive, personal conflicts unfolding under extreme pressure, and somewhere in the chaos, the lingering question disaster movies have always asked: when everything falls apart, what parts of humanity remain standing? Few movie concepts arrive with built-in curiosity the way 2012 did. Long before the film even hit theaters, the idea of the world ending in 2012 had already captured the public imagination. News segments debated it, internet forums exploded with theories. Documentaries speculated endlessly about it. The date, December 24, 2012, had quietly become one of the most talked about end-of-the-world predictions in modern pop culture. And that fascination is exactly what this film taps into. The premise is built around a popular interpretation of the ancient Mayan calendar. According to widespread rumors circulating at the time, the calendar simply stopped on that date, which many people interpreted as a cosmic countdown to humanity's final moment. In reality, historians and archaeologists had long clarified that the Mayan calendar didn't predict apocalypse at all. It merely completed a cycle, much like the way our own calendar rolls over from December 31st to January 1st. But for a blockbuster disaster movie, that misunderstanding was pure storytelling gold. Because once you start with the idea that the world might be approaching a final day, the possibilities for cinematic chaos become limitless. In 2012, the film blends that ancient myth with a dose of dramatic pseudoscience. Scientists discover that intense solar activity is sending strange neutrino particles into Earth's core, superheating the planet from within. The crust begins to destabilize, tectonic plates shift, volcanoes erupt. Massive earthquakes tear through cities. Oceans surge inland in towering waves. Suddenly, what started as an obscure calendar theory becomes the trigger for global extinction. And that's where the premise becomes so powerful. It taps into something deeply human, our fascination with doomsday scenarios. Throughout history, civilizations have predicted the end of the world again and again, from ancient prophecies to modern conspiracy theories. Every generation seems to wonder, at some point, whether the world might suddenly stop. 2012 simply takes that ancient fear and magnifies it on a blockbuster scale. Instead of a localized disaster, the movie imagines a chain reaction that destroys the entire planet. Continents fracture, cities collapse, entire civilizations vanish beneath water and fire. Humanity itself becomes a species racing against extinction. But what makes the premise especially compelling is that the catastrophe isn't framed as punishment or divine intervention. There are no angry gods or invading monsters here. The threat comes from the planet itself, a natural chain reaction that humanity has no power to stop. That idea changes the tone of the disaster. Because if the Earth itself is unraveling, survival becomes less about fighting an enemy and more about outrunning inevitability. And the movie leans heavily into that sense of urgency. As scientists uncover the truth behind the approaching catastrophe, governments quietly prepare contingency plans. Secret survival projects begin. World leaders scramble to preserve fragments of civilization before it disappears entirely. Meanwhile, ordinary people continue living their lives, completely unaware that the countdown has already begun. That contrast between global extinction and everyday normalcy gives the premise its emotional tension. For the characters in the story, the apocalypse isn't a distant theory anymore. It's an unstoppable event racing toward them. But beyond the spectacle, the concept also raises a deeper question. If humanity knew the world was ending, what would we choose to save? Knowledge, culture, political power, wealth, families? The film hints at those questions through its survival plan, where only a tiny fraction of humanity is selected to escape the catastrophe. It suggests that even at the end of civilization, the decisions about who survives and who doesn't are shaped by the same forces that shape the world today. Power, money, influence. In that sense, the premise of 2012 is more than just a setup for destruction. It's a reflection of how humans react when faced with the ultimate crisis. But at its core, the film never forgets why audiences came to see it. The prophecy isn't there to be dissected academically. It's there to ignite the biggest possible disaster scenario imaginable. A myth becomes a catalyst. A misunderstood calendar becomes the spark that unleashes planetary chaos. And once that spark is lit, the movie wastes no time showing what happens when the countdown finally reaches zero. If there's one thing 2012 makes absolutely clear from the moment disaster strikes, it's this. The movie exists to destroy the world in the most spectacular way possible. Not just one city, not just one country, the entire planet. This is where the film fully embraces its identity as a visual spectacle. Roland Emmerich doesn't treat destruction as a background element, he treats it as the main event. Buildings don't just fall apart quickly in the distance, they crumble in slow, massive waves. Highways tear open beneath speeding cars, entire city blocks collapse like dominoes, and every second of that chaos is designed to be as visually overwhelming as possible. One of the film's biggest strengths lies in how clearly the destruction is staged. In many modern blockbuster movies, action sequences become chaotic blurs, quick cuts, shaky cameras, explosions happening everywhere at once. But here, Emmerich often does something different. He pulls the camera back. He lets the audience see the scale of the catastrophe unfold. You watch cracks spread across streets like living veins. Skyscrapers lean, buckle, and collapse in slow arcs. The ground itself opens like a giant trap swallowing entire neighborhoods. The camera doesn't rush past the destruction, it lingers on it. And that choice makes the disaster feel enormous. But visuals alone aren't what make these sequences powerful. The sound design plays a huge role in selling the illusion. Every collapsing building groans and tears apart with a deep mechanical roar. Concrete shatters. Metal twists. Shock waves ripple through the city like thunder rolling across the sky. When a skyscraper falls in 2012, it doesn't just fall silently. It sounds like the world itself is breaking. Then there's the musical score, which amplifies everything even further. Instead of subtle background music, the soundtrack swells dramatically beneath each catastrophe. Strings rise, drums pound, and the moment takes on a grand, almost operatic feeling. It's not just destruction, it's spectacle. And the movie pushes that spectacle further and further as the story unfolds. What starts with collapsing highways quickly escalates into something far bigger. Entire cities sink into the earth. Massive earthquakes ripple across continents. Volcanic eruptions darken the sky with ash. Tsunamis rise so high they swallow coastlines whole. The scale becomes almost absurd. But that's exactly the point. Because 2012 isn't trying to show a realistic disaster, it's trying to stage the biggest cinematic apocalypse imaginable. One of the most interesting creative choices in the film is how the environment itself becomes the threat. In many action movies, the danger comes from a villain or a monster. But here, the enemy is the planet itself. The ground cracks open beneath people's feet. Buildings tilt like predators ready to strike. Empty space becomes deadly as entire landscapes collapse into enormous chasms. The setting isn't just where the action happens. The setting is the action. That idea gives the film a unique visual identity. Instead of focusing on one specific threat, the entire world turns hostile. Streets, mountains, oceans, and cities all become moving parts in a giant chain reaction of destruction. And yet, for all its technical brilliance, the spectacle creates a strange contradiction. The destruction is massive, almost beautiful in its scale, but sometimes it feels emotionally distant. When entire cities collapse in wide digital shots, the human cost can feel abstract. The audience watches buildings fall with awe, but the tragedy behind those images doesn't always land with the same weight. In other words, the visuals are stunning, but they can also feel strangely hollow. Still, there's no denying the ambition. The effects teams were clearly given one simple mission: dismantle the planet in the most dramatic ways imaginable, and they deliver. Whether it's highways splitting apart beneath speeding cars, aircraft flying through collapsing skylines, or tidal waves towering over entire continents, the film constantly tries to outdo its own destruction. Each sequence is bigger than the last, louder than the last, and more outrageous than the last. By the time the apocalypse reaches its peak, the question isn't whether the world will survive. The question is whether there's anything left that hasn't already been destroyed. And that relentless commitment to spectacle is exactly what defines 2012. It may struggle with characters or story at times, but when it comes to pure visual chaos, the movie doesn't hold back for a second. One of the most overlooked aspects of 2012 is how Roland Emmerich actually directs chaos. Because staging large-scale destruction on screen is harder than it looks. In many modern blockbusters, once explosions begin, the visuals become almost impossible to follow. Quick cuts, shaky cameras, and overlapping effects can turn action scenes into visual noise. Things are exploding everywhere, but the audience can't actually understand what's happening or where the danger is coming from. Emmerich approaches it differently. Instead of hiding the destruction inside frantic editing, he often lets it unfold in full view. The camera pulls back. It gives the audience space to see the catastrophe developing. Buildings tilt slowly before they collapse. Highways split open like fractures spreading across glass. Entire city blocks begin sliding apart while the camera calmly tracks the chain reaction. It's destruction designed with geography and movement in mind. You always know where the characters are in relation to the danger. You see the crack racing across the ground toward them. You see the building starting to fall before it actually does. That clarity makes the spectacle feel bigger and strangely more believable, even when the physics themselves are completely ridiculous. Take the famous Los Angeles collapse sequence. Instead of cutting rapidly between random explosions, Emmerich builds the sequence like a domino chain. One street breaks apart, which causes nearby structures to collapse, which triggers another collapse further down the skyline. The camera glides through the chaos while the city dismantles itself piece by piece. It's not just destruction, it's orchestrated destruction. And that orchestration becomes one of Emmerich's greatest strengths as a director. He understands that spectacle works best when the audience can follow the scale of the disaster. The camera becomes almost like a witness flying through the catastrophe, showing the ripple effect of devastation as it spreads outward. Another important element of his direction is how he treats the environment itself. In most action films, the setting is just the background where the action happens. But in 2012, the environment becomes an active force. The ground cracks open like a predator chasing its prey. Skyscrapers lean forward as if they're about to strike. Entire landscapes shift, slide, and swallow everything in their path. The world itself becomes the antagonist. That idea transforms the movie visually. The camera doesn't just capture characters reacting to destruction, it captures destruction hunting them. Cracks chase cars. Buildings fall toward fleeing people. Empty space becomes the threat. The setting stops being scenery. It becomes a character. And that's where Emmerich's directing instincts really shine. He understands how to animate large spaces in a way that feels dynamic and threatening. Streets, mountains, oceans, and cities all behave like moving parts in a gigantic machine that's coming apart. But of course, that same ambition is also where the film begins to show its limits. Because while Emmerich can stage destruction brilliantly, he sometimes struggles to bring the same precision to the human side of the story. The spectacle is carefully choreographed. The characters, less so. Emotional moments often feel rushed or overshadowed by the next collapsing building. In other words, the visual storytelling is stronger than the dramatic storytelling. Still, it's hard to deny that Emmerich has a unique skill when it comes to large-scale cinematic chaos. Few directors are willing to stage destruction this openly, letting the audience absorb the full scope instead of hiding it behind editing tricks. And that's why, even when 2012 becomes ridiculous, and it often does, the spectacle rarely feels confusing. The mayhem may be outrageous, but it's almost always visually coherent. You understand the scale, you understand the danger, and you understand exactly how the world is falling apart. For a movie built around the end of civilization, that clarity makes a huge difference. It turns what could have been messy digital chaos into something closer to a massive, carefully choreographed disaster symphony. And in that sense, Roland Emmerich proves something very important here. Anyone can blow up a city on screen. But it takes a certain kind of director to make the audience watch every second of it collapse. For a movie that destroys the entire planet, 2012 actually spends a surprising amount of time introducing people. Fathers, scientists, presidents, billionaires, conspiracy theorists. The film assembles a full cast of characters meant to guide us through the apocalypse. But here's the catch. Most of them aren't really characters in the traditional sense. They're archetypes. That's not necessarily unusual for disaster movies. In fact, the genre has always relied on recognizable character types to quickly establish emotional stakes. You get the flawed hero, the morally upright scientist, the cynical government official, the concerned parent, the eccentric outsider who saw it coming all along. These roles act like emotional shortcuts. Audiences immediately understand who these people are supposed to represent, and 2012 follows that blueprint almost perfectly. At the center of the story is Jackson Curtis, played by John Cusack. He's the classic disaster movie protagonist, an ordinary guy with an imperfect life suddenly thrown into extraordinary circumstances. Jackson is a struggling writer who now drives a limousine for a living, and his personal life is just as unstable as the planet he's about to run across. His marriage has fallen apart. His children feel distant from him. He's a father trying to reconnect with his family just as the world begins collapsing. It's a setup that feels instantly familiar, and that's intentional. Cusack brings a grounded sincerity to the role, which helps keep the character relatable even as the situations around him become completely absurd. No matter how impossible the escapes get, his performance anchors the film with a kind of everyday human reaction: confusion, fear, determination. Then there's Adrian Helmsley, played by Chiwetel Ejiofor. Adrian represents the moral conscience of the story. He's the scientist who discovers the impending catastrophe and spends the film struggling with the ethical consequences of what humanity is about to do. While governments secretly prepare survival plans that will save only a fraction of the population, Adrian wrestles with the question that hangs over the entire film: who deserves to survive? Ejiofor gives the character a quiet gravitas that almost elevates the material around him. On the opposite side of that moral debate stands Carl Anheuser, played by Oliver Platt. Carl is the pragmatic strategist, the man responsible for executing the survival plan. Where Adrian argues for compassion, Carl argues for logistics. In his view, emotions are luxuries the world can no longer afford. Survival requires efficiency, even if that means leaving billions behind. It's a classic disaster movie dynamic: morality versus practicality. Then there's President Thomas Wilson, portrayed by Danny Glover. His role embodies dignity and calm leadership in the face of extinction. Instead of fleeing to safety, he chooses to stay behind with the people he leads, a decision framed as an act of sacrifice and principle. And finally, perhaps the most memorable presence in the film, Charlie Frost, played by Woody Harrelson. Charlie is the conspiracy theorist who has been broadcasting warnings about the apocalypse long before anyone else takes them seriously. Harelson leans fully into the character's eccentricity, delivering a performance that's loud, unpredictable, and strangely captivating. While the rest of the film struggles to balance seriousness and absurdity, Harelson seems to understand exactly what kind of movie he's in, and he runs with it. Despite the strong cast, however, the film rarely gives these actors the depth they deserve. Most of the characters exist to serve the plot rather than develop as fully realized people. Their emotional arcs follow familiar patterns. The estranged father redeems himself, the scientist stands up for humanity, the bureaucrat prioritizes survival at any cost. The dialogue doesn't help either. Many conversations feel less like natural exchanges and more like narrative instructions. Characters announce plans, explain scientific discoveries, or deliver emotional speeches exactly when the story needs them to. Subtlety is rarely part of the equation. In a movie this large, character development often takes a back seat to spectacle, and that creates one of the film's biggest contradictions. Because while the story wants the audience to feel the emotional weight of humanity's extinction, the people experiencing that extinction rarely feel complex enough to carry that weight. They function as symbols, representatives of certain ideas, rather than individuals with layered personalities. But maybe that's also part of the genre. Disaster movies often treat characters as lenses through which we witness catastrophe, rather than as the central focus themselves. They are our guides through the chaos. Their job is to run, react, argue, and survive while the real star of the show unfolds around them. And in 2012, that real star is clearly not any individual character. It's the destruction itself. Beneath all the collapsing cities, towering waves, and splitting continents, 2012 actually revolves around something much smaller: a broken family. Because at the heart of the film's chaos is the story of Jackson Curtis, an ordinary father trying to reconnect with his children just as the world begins to end. This isn't accidental. Disaster movies have always relied on personal relationships to anchor the spectacle. Without a human story to follow, all the destruction becomes abstract. So the film places a fractured family directly in the path of global catastrophe. Jackson is introduced as a man who has lost control of his life. Once a hopeful novelist, he now drives a limousine for a wealthy client while watching his family drift further away from him. His ex-wife Kate has moved on, his children are growing up without him, and the man now helping raise them. Kate's new partner, Gordon, appears to be everything Jackson isn't: stable, responsible, present. It's a familiar setup, almost a textbook example of the disaster movie redemption arc. But what makes this dynamic interesting is how quickly the end of the world forces these characters into the same survival story. As earthquakes rip through California and cities collapse around them, the complicated emotional distance between Jackson and his family suddenly becomes irrelevant. Because when the planet starts tearing itself apart, survival becomes the only priority. The film repeatedly places this family at the center of escalating disasters. Highways crack open beneath their car. Skyscrapers collapse around them. Planes lift off seconds before runways disintegrate. Every escape becomes more impossible than the last. And through it all, the family dynamic slowly begins to shift. Jackson isn't just the absent father anymore. He becomes the one guiding them through the chaos. The same man who struggled to connect with his children now becomes their protector, constantly racing against destruction to keep them alive. It's a transformation that the film leans on heavily. Each near-death escape becomes another step in Jackson's redemption. Every moment he manages to save his children reinforces the idea that, despite his past mistakes, he's still their father, and he's willing to risk everything for them. Meanwhile, the film quietly begins dissolving the life Kate built without him. Gordon, the new partner who initially appears stable and dependable, gradually fades from the narrative. His fate arrives suddenly during one of the film's disasters, clearing the path for Jackson and Kate's reconciliation. It's a storytelling choice that feels almost mechanical. The structure is obvious. The world is ending. Old relationships crumble, and the original family unit finds its way back together. The apocalypse becomes the catalyst for emotional repair. And this is where the film's emotional logic begins to show its limitations. Because while the destruction unfolding around them is enormous, the family story itself follows a very predictable path. The estranged father proves his worth. The separated couple rediscover their connection. The children realize their father never truly abandoned them. It's comforting, familiar, and almost inevitable. Still, there's a reason disaster films rely on this kind of storyline. When the scale of destruction becomes overwhelming, audiences need something personal to hold on to. The fate of humanity may feel too large to process emotionally, but the fate of one family is something viewers can connect with. So while entire continents collapse in the background, the film keeps returning to this small emotional center, a father trying to keep his children alive long enough to reach safety. And in the end, that's the emotional promise the movie makes. No matter how big the catastrophe becomes, no matter how many cities fall, no matter how many lives are lost, this one family will endure, not because they're stronger than anyone else, but because in disaster cinema, survival is rarely random, it's personal. As the catastrophe in 2012 grows larger and larger, the story eventually arrives at its most unsettling idea. Not everyone will survive. Long before the earthquakes begin and the oceans rise, world governments secretly come to a grim conclusion. The planet cannot be saved. The disasters are unstoppable. Humanity's only chance is to preserve a small fraction of the population and rebuild civilization after the apocalypse. So they create a plan. Hidden deep in the mountains of China, enormous survival vessels, massive technological arcs, are constructed in complete secrecy. These colossal ships are designed to ride out the planetary destruction while the rest of the world collapses. The concept is clearly inspired by the ancient story of Noah's Ark. But unlike the biblical version, this ark doesn't operate on divine selection or moral judgment. It operates on power and money. Seats aboard the vessels are limited. Governments choose a handful of scientists, engineers, political leaders, and cultural figures to preserve humanity's knowledge and leadership. But the majority of available space is sold to the ultra-wealthy, billionaires capable of paying unimaginable sums for survival. In other words, the future of humanity becomes a luxury product. The film briefly confronts the moral weight of this decision through the character of Adrian Helmsley. As one of the scientists involved in the survival project, Adrian understands the brutal reality of the situation. Billions of people will die while a tiny fraction escape, and the criteria for survival isn't necessarily virtue, intelligence, or compassion. It's access. This creates one of the film's most interesting moral conflicts. Adrian argues that the survival plan should include more ordinary people, that humanity's future shouldn't be determined solely by wealth or political influence. But others involved in the project take a colder view. They argue that when extinction is inevitable, practicality must replace idealism. There simply isn't enough space. The film never fully explores this ethical dilemma in depth, but the tension is there. The survival plan exposes an uncomfortable truth. Even at the end of the world, humanity's systems of power and privilege remain intact. The wealthy secure lifeboats. Everyone else faces the flood. The arrival of these enormous arcs also marks a shift in the film's structure. Up to this point, the story has been about outrunning disaster. But once the survival vessels enter the narrative, the focus changes. Now it becomes a race to reach salvation before the doors close. Jackson Curtis and his family suddenly find themselves chasing a place aboard these vessels, navigating bureaucratic barriers, security checkpoints, and desperate crowds all trying to reach the same destination. The apocalypse is no longer just about escaping earthquakes or tidal waves. It's about gaining access to humanity's last lifeboat. The symbolism here is impossible to ignore. Humanity has built a technological ark not just to survive the disaster, but to preserve the systems and hierarchies that existed before it. The same power structures that defined the old world quietly shaped the new one as well. And yet, in the film's final moments, that system begins to crack. As the disaster reaches its peak, the characters confront the reality of what they've created. A survival plan built on exclusivity begins to look less like salvation and more like abandonment. In a moment of last-minute compassion, the gates are open to allow more survivors aboard. It's the movie's way of restoring a sense of humanity to the story. But the uncomfortable question remains: if the world truly ended tomorrow, who would get a place on the ark, and who would be left behind? If there's one criticism that appears again and again when people talk about 2012, it's not the explosions, the science, or even the acting. It's the length. At nearly 58 minutes, the film runs for well over 2.5 hours, an enormous runtime for a disaster movie whose central idea can be summed up very simply: the world is ending, and a small group of people are trying to survive it. Now, long movies aren't necessarily a problem. Some of the greatest blockbusters ever made stretch beyond 2 hours. But those films usually balance their runtime with layered characters, evolving themes, or shifting narrative momentum. 2012 takes a different approach. Instead of deepening the story, it multiplies the spectacle. The pacing follows a very specific rhythm: setup, destruction, escape, and then repeat that cycle again and again, each time escalating the scale of the disaster. Early in the film, we watch characters narrowly escape collapsing highways. Later, they're outrunning volcanic eruptions. Eventually, they're dodging entire cities falling apart beneath them. Each sequence tries to outdo the last, and for a while, that escalation works. The early disaster scenes, especially the famous California collapse, are genuinely thrilling. The tension is real, the scale feels enormous, and the audience can feel the adrenaline of characters racing against the destruction. But as the runtime stretches further and further, the formula begins to show its limits. The escapes become repetitive. Cars outrun earthquakes. Planes lift off seconds before runways collapse. Buildings fall inches behind fleeing characters. Once or twice, these moments feel exciting. But when the same type of narrow escape happens again and again, the suspense begins to fade. Instead of wondering whether the characters will survive, the audience starts assuming they will. The near misses stop feeling miraculous and start feeling inevitable. Another pacing challenge comes from how the film structures its disasters. Rather than allowing time for emotional consequences between events, the story jumps rapidly from one catastrophe to the next. Entire cities are destroyed, millions of people are implied to die, and yet the narrative rarely pauses long enough to explore the human impact of those losses. The next disaster is always just around the corner. And then there's the final act, which becomes the film's most controversial stretch. Once the story shifts toward the massive arcs in the Himalayas, the pacing slows dramatically. The rush to board the vessels, which should feel like the climax of the entire story, instead becomes a long sequence of delays, mechanical problems, and last-minute complications. Characters argue, doors jam, engines fail, floodwaters rise. Each obstacle adds another layer of tension, but the sequence continues for so long that it begins to feel artificially stretched. By the time the final crisis is resolved, the sense of urgency has started to wear thin. Ironically, the movie's biggest strength, its relentless escalation of destruction, becomes its biggest weakness. Because when everything is constantly at maximum intensity, nothing feels like the true peak. The spectacle starts to blur together. Still, it's important to remember that the film's pacing issues come from ambition rather than laziness. The filmmakers clearly wanted to deliver the ultimate disaster experience, not just one catastrophe, but every catastrophe imaginable. Earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, continents shifting. The goal wasn't restraint. The goal was total escalation. And in that sense, the runtime reflects the movie's philosophy. If you're going to destroy the world, you might as well destroy it thoroughly. But for some viewers, that commitment to excess turns the experience into a marathon rather than a thrill ride. By the time the final wave crashes and the arcs finally sail towards safety, the audience may feel less exhilarated than exhausted. The apocalypse, after all, is a lot to sit through for nearly 3 hours. And sometimes the biggest disaster in 2012 isn't what happens on screen, it's how long it takes to get there. One of the most fascinating and controversial elements of 2012 is the way it explains the apocalypse itself. Because the movie doesn't rely on aliens, supernatural forces, or divine punishment to destroy the planet. Instead, it tries to wrap its catastrophe in scientific language. Early in the film, scientists discover something deeply alarming. Unusual solar activity is sending strange neutrino particles toward Earth. These particles begin interacting with the planet's core, superheating it from the inside. As the temperature rises, the Earth's crust becomes unstable. Tectonic plates begin shifting, volcanoes awaken, massive earthquakes ripple across continents. Eventually, the planet's entire surface begins to break apart. On paper, it sounds like a scientific explanation for global catastrophe, the kind of theory that might make the disaster feel grounded in reality. But the moment you look a little closer, the science begins to unravel. Neutrinos, for example, are real particles produced by stars like our Sun. But in reality, they pass through Earth constantly without interacting with anything. They're incredibly difficult to detect because they almost never collide with matter. The idea that neutrinos could suddenly start heating the Earth's core like a cosmic microwave oven isn't just unlikely, it's essentially impossible. Then there's the film's concept of crust displacement, where the Earth's outer layer suddenly shifts and continents slide across the surface. The movie suggests that this movement could cause entire land masses to relocate while oceans surge across the planet. Again, it's a dramatic idea, but modern geology doesn't support it. Real tectonic plate movement happens extremely slowly, measured in centimeters per year. The kind of instant planetary rearrangement shown in the movie would require forces so enormous that the Earth itself might not survive the process. But here's the interesting thing. The film never pretends that its science is airtight. In fact, even the characters inside the story react with disbelief when they first see the data. Scientists themselves admit that what's happening shouldn't be possible. The explanation becomes less about strict scientific accuracy and more about giving the audience a narrative trigger for the disaster. And that's an important distinction, because disaster movies have always relied on exaggerated science to kickstart their stories. Armageddon imagined oil drillers saving the planet from an asteroid. The Day After Tomorrow showed the entire climate system collapsing within days. Even classic disaster films from the 1970s stretched geological plausibility in order to stage their spectacles. In 2012, the pseudoscience functions the same way. It's not meant to be a detailed scientific thesis, it's a narrative fuse, something that explains why the apocalypse begins and then quickly steps aside once the destruction starts. After the initial explanation, the film rarely returns to the scientific mechanics again. The disasters escalate, the planet destabilizes, and the story shifts its focus to survival rather than explanation. In other words, the science opens the door, but the spectacle walks through it. For some viewers, this approach works perfectly. They accept the pseudoscience as part of the ride, understanding that the real goal of the movie isn't to teach geology. It's to deliver the most dramatic planetary destruction imaginable. For others, the shaky logic becomes impossible to ignore. The more the film explains its apocalypse, the more the explanation begins to collapse under scrutiny. But perhaps the film's creators understood that from the beginning, because the deeper truth behind 2012 isn't scientific accuracy, it's myth-making. The movie blends fragments of real science with popular end-of-the-world theories, ancient calendar myths, and modern conspiracy culture. It takes ideas that circulated widely in public imagination and transforms them into a cinematic catastrophe. In that sense, the science in 2012 isn't really about physics or geology at all. It's about storytelling, a way to turn a misunderstood prophecy and a handful of speculative theories into the ultimate disaster scenario. And once the ground starts splitting open and oceans begin swallowing cities, the movie quietly asks the audience to make a simple decision. Do you want scientific realism, or do you want to watch the world end on the biggest screen possible? One of the biggest challenges a movie like 2012 faces isn't the scale of its destruction, it's the predictability of its storytelling. Because despite all the collapsing cities and world-ending catastrophes, the narrative itself follows a path that feels strangely familiar. If you've seen a handful of disaster movies before, you can almost predict how many of the story's emotional beats will unfold long before they actually happen. And that's because the film leans heavily on the classic disaster formula. You start with a warning that most people ignore. Then scientists realize the threat is real. Governments scramble behind closed doors. Ordinary people slowly discover that something is terribly wrong. Eventually, chaos erupts. From that moment on, the story becomes a sequence of escalating close calls. The heroes barely escape one disaster before immediately running into another. Every obstacle appears insurmountable for a few seconds, and then somehow, the characters manage to survive by the narrowest possible margin. In 2012, that pattern repeats over and over again. Cars outrun collapsing highways. Planes lift off seconds before runways crumble. Buildings fall inches behind fleeing characters. At first, these moments are exhilarating. The audience feels the rush of danger and the thrill of escape. But as the same structure repeats again and again, something begins to change. The suspense starts to fade. Because the audience eventually realizes something important. The main characters aren't really in danger. The movie has quietly established a kind of narrative protection around them. No matter how impossible the situation becomes, they will almost certainly find a way to survive. In storytelling terms, this is often called plot armor. It's the invisible shield that protects central characters from consequences that would realistically end the story much earlier. In 2012, that shield becomes stronger with each new catastrophe. The characters survive situations that seem increasingly impossible, until the near misses begin to feel less like miracles and more like inevitabilities. Another element that reinforces the predictability is the way characters are written. The morally upright scientist will argue for compassion. The ruthless bureaucrat will defend cold practicality. The estranged father will eventually redeem himself. The corrupt billionaire will face consequences. These roles are so familiar that audiences can recognize their narrative purpose almost instantly. Once the characters settle into those archetypes, their arcs become easier to anticipate, and that predictability shapes the emotional experience of the film. Instead of constantly wondering what will happen next, viewers often find themselves waiting for the next step in a pattern they already understand. But here's the interesting thing. This predictability isn't necessarily a flaw unique to 2012. It's a feature of the disaster genre itself. Disaster movies have always followed recognizable structures. The pleasure of the genre doesn't come entirely from surprise. It comes from watching how the familiar formula unfolds on an ever larger scale. Each new film tries to deliver the same emotional rhythm while raising the stakes. Bigger destruction, more elaborate escapes, higher waves, larger explosions. In that sense, 2012 isn't really trying to reinvent the disaster formula. Instead, it embraces it completely. The movie becomes almost like a greatest hits collection of disaster movie moments, stacking one recognizable trope on top of another until the scale becomes overwhelming. For some viewers, that familiarity becomes part of the fun. They know what kind of ride they're on, and they're happy to see the spectacle unfold exactly as expected. For others, the repetition eventually dulls the impact. The more times characters escape death by a few inches, the less thrilling those escapes begin to feel. By the time the story reaches its final act, the biggest surprise isn't which characters survive. It's that the formula itself never changes. And that raises an interesting question about the disaster genre as a whole. When the world ends on screen, do audiences really want a new story, or do they want the same story told on an even bigger scale? One of the most unusual things about 2012 is how seriously it tries to take itself. On the surface, the movie presents a scenario that is almost unimaginably tragic. Entire continents collapse, oceans swallow cities, billions of people vanish in a matter of hours. Humanity itself stands on the brink of extinction. That kind of premise should feel devastating. And yet, throughout the film, the tone often drifts into something very different: melodrama. Characters deliver emotional speeches about unity and survival. Families reconcile while the world burns around them. Leaders make noble sacrifices. Music swells dramatically as the final survivors sail toward a hopeful future. The film wants these moments to feel profound, but sometimes the scale of the disaster makes that emotional tone difficult to sustain. Because when you step back and think about what's happening in the background, billions of lives lost, entire civilizations erased. The story's focus on a handful of characters exchanging heartfelt dialogue can start to feel strangely disconnected from the magnitude of the catastrophe. The emotional beats become bigger and more dramatic, but not necessarily deeper. This creates one of the film's most interesting tonal contradictions. On one hand, the movie is clearly aiming for epic seriousness. It frames the apocalypse as a monumental human tragedy, complete with moral dilemmas, heroic sacrifices, and speeches about humanity's future. On the other hand, the spectacle is so extreme that it sometimes crosses into unintended comedy. Cars outrun collapsing cities. Planes escape volcanic eruptions by seconds. Characters pause for emotional conversations while the ground literally splits open behind them. Moments that are meant to inspire awe can occasionally provoke laughter instead, not because the audience is mocking the film, but because the scale of the absurdity becomes impossible to ignore. This tension between seriousness and absurdity runs through the entire movie. Some characters lean into the dramatic weight of the situation. Danny Glover's president, for example, embodies the idea of dignified leadership. His decision to remain behind with the American people rather than escape aboard the survival vessels is framed as a noble act of sacrifice. But the emotional impact of that decision is complicated by the context surrounding it. When the entire planet is collapsing, gestures of individual heroism can feel symbolic rather than meaningful. Then there's Woody Harrelson's character, Charlie Frost. Unlike many of the other characters, Frost seems to exist in a completely different tonal universe. As a conspiracy theorist who has been predicting the apocalypse for years, he reacts to the world's destruction with manic excitement rather than solemn dread. And strangely enough, that approach sometimes feels more honest. Harelson plays the role with full awareness of the film's outrageousness. While others struggle to maintain emotional gravity, Frost embraces the madness of the situation. His energy cuts through the movie's melodrama and reminds the audience just how surreal the entire premise really is. In many ways, the film works best when it stops trying to be solemn and simply embraces its own absurdity. When the movie focuses on pure spectacle, collapsing cities, massive tidal waves, impossible escapes, the tone feels consistent. The audience understands that they're watching a gigantic disaster fantasy. But whenever the story pauses to insist that these moments carry deep emotional significance, the balance becomes more fragile. The film wants to be both a tragic epic and an exhilarating roller coaster, and sometimes those two ambitions collide. Still, that tonal tension is part of what makes 2012 such a fascinating movie to watch. It constantly teeters between awe and absurdity, between genuine spectacle and accidental comedy. At its best, the film delivers breathtaking images of a world collapsing in spectacular fashion. At its most awkward, it reminds us that even the end of civilization can become strangely theatrical when Hollywood tries to stage it. And maybe that's the strange truth about disaster movies. When the stakes become planetary, the only way to keep the story moving is to make the emotions just as enormous, even if they occasionally tip over the edge. Beyond the explosions and collapsing cities, 2012 quietly weaves a surprising amount of symbolism into its spectacle. The film may present itself as a modern disaster blockbuster, but beneath the surface it draws heavily from mythology, religious imagery, and cultural iconography. The most obvious symbol appears in the survival vessels themselves. The massive ships built in the Himalayas are essentially modern versions of Noah's Ark. Just like the biblical story, humanity faces a world-ending flood. Just like Noah's Ark, a small group of chosen survivors boards enormous vessels meant to preserve life while the rest of the world is wiped away. Even the protagonist's name subtly reinforces this connection. Jackson Curtis's son is named Noah, a detail that feels almost too deliberate to ignore. It's a small but clear nod to the ancient story that inspired the entire survival plan. The film doesn't dwell on this symbolism openly, but the parallel is unmistakable. Humanity once again survives the flood by building an ark. But the film complicates that symbolism in interesting ways. Unlike the biblical story, where survival is tied to moral righteousness, the ark in 2012 is largely controlled by political power and wealth. Instead of divine selection, the passengers are chosen through government decisions and financial privilege. This transforms the ark from a symbol of spiritual salvation into something more uncomfortable, a lifeboat for the powerful. Religious imagery appears elsewhere throughout the film as well, sometimes in ways that feel almost ironic. As the world collapses, famous spiritual landmarks are destroyed alongside everything else. The towering statue of Christ the Redeemer fractures during a massive earthquake. The Vatican trembles as the ground opens beneath it. Sacred architecture that once symbolized divine protection is reduced to rubble. These images raise subtle questions about faith and survival. If the apocalypse truly arrived, would sacred spaces offer protection, or would they fall alongside the rest of human civilization? The film never directly answers those questions, but the imagery suggests a world where human institutions, religious or political, cannot stop the planet's collapse. Even the president's final speech reflects this tension. In a moment meant to inspire hope, he calls for unity across faiths, invoking both spirituality and shared humanity as the world begins to unravel. The speech aims to comfort people facing extinction. But at the same time, it highlights how powerless those words are against the scale of what's happening. The film also plays with cultural symbolism in its portrayal of survival itself. Humanity's last refuge isn't located in America or Europe, it's hidden in the mountains of China. The arks are constructed there, and the final survivors eventually sail toward Africa, a continent often described as the cradle of human civilization. In symbolic terms, humanity's journey becomes almost cyclical. Civilization collapses, the survivors retreat to the mountains, and when the waters recede, they return to the continent where humanity first began. It's a subtle but powerful visual metaphor, the idea that after the apocalypse, humanity must begin again from its earliest origins. Of course, the film never fully explores these symbolic ideas in depth. They appear briefly between action sequences before the next wave of destruction takes center stage, but their presence adds an unexpected layer beneath the spectacle. Because while 2012 is primarily about watching the world fall apart, it also hints at something more mythic. Ancient prophecies, biblical floods, civilizations collapsing and beginning again. The movie may present itself as a modern scientific apocalypse, but many of its images come straight from humanity's oldest stories about the end of the world. And perhaps that's part of why these stories continue to fascinate us. Because long before CGI could show continents breaking apart, people were already imagining the same question: if the world truly ended, what kind of world would rise from the ruins? Before 2012 even reached theaters, the movie was already riding a wave of real-world fascination. For years leading up to the film's release, the idea that the world might end on December 24, 2012 had become a cultural obsession. Documentaries speculated about it. Online forums exploded with theories. Books and television specials debated the mysterious Mayan calendar and what its final date might mean. The internet amplified the mystery even further. Some people treated the theory as entertainment. Others genuinely worried that something catastrophic might actually happen. And Hollywood saw an opportunity. Instead of simply promoting a disaster movie, the marketing campaign for 2012 cleverly leaned into that real-world curiosity. The film blurred the line between fiction and speculation, building a promotional strategy that made the apocalypse feel strangely plausible, at least for those willing to suspend disbelief. One of the most fascinating elements of the campaign was the creation of fictional organizations tied directly to the film's story. Websites appeared online for something called the Institute for Human Continuity. Visitors could explore survival plans, read about humanity's supposed preparation for the coming disaster, and even register themselves as potential candidates for preservation after the apocalypse. It looked official enough to convince some viewers that the organization might actually be real. The campaign didn't stop there. Viral videos, fake scientific reports, and fictional broadcasts spread across the internet, all reinforcing the idea that governments might secretly be preparing for a global catastrophe. In other words, the marketing turned the movie's premise into a kind of interactive mystery. For many people, it worked almost too well. Scientists and historians reported receiving real questions from worried members of the public who wondered whether the Mayan calendar actually predicted the end of the world. Some researchers even had to publicly clarify that the calendar cycle ending in 2012 had never meant apocalypse at all. It was simply the completion of a timekeeping cycle. But by that point, the cultural conversation had already taken on a life of its own. The film's promotional campaign also included one of the most ambitious advertising strategies ever attempted for a blockbuster. A massive roadblock event aired a dramatic clip from the movie simultaneously across hundreds of television networks, reaching tens of millions of viewers at the same moment. It was spectacle before the spectacle. In a way, the marketing itself mirrored the scale of the film. Just as the movie attempted to destroy the entire planet on screen, the promotional campaign attempted to capture the entire media landscape. And it worked. By the time 2012 finally arrived in theaters, audiences were already familiar with the concept. The film wasn't introducing a new idea. It was delivering a cinematic version of a cultural phenomenon that had been building for years. But once the real date passed in December 2012, something interesting happened. Nothing. No planetary catastrophe. No cosmic alignment. No end of civilization. The myth quietly dissolved back into internet history, joining a long list of apocalyptic predictions that had come and gone without consequence. And yet, the movie remains a fascinating artifact of that moment in time. It captures a period when ancient prophecy, internet conspiracy theories, and blockbuster filmmaking all collided in the public imagination. For a brief cultural moment, people around the world were asking the same question: what if the world really was about to end? 2012 didn't create that question, but it certainly knew how to turn it into a spectacle. And in doing so, it became more than just another disaster movie. It became the cinematic centerpiece of one of the most widely discussed end-of-the-world predictions of the modern era. When everything in 2012 finally settles, the earthquakes stop, the oceans calm, and the last survivors drift toward a reshaped world, one question quietly hangs in the air. What exactly did we just watch? Because 2012 is a movie that operates on extremes. It doesn't aim to be subtle. It doesn't try to be restrained. Instead, it pushes the disaster genre to its absolute limit, stacking catastrophe on top of catastrophe until the entire planet collapses beneath the weight of its own spectacle. And in that sense, the film succeeds exactly as intended. Roland Emmerich has built his career on orchestrating large-scale destruction, and here he finally escalates to the ultimate version of that idea. Earlier films might have destroyed a city, a continent, or a single ecosystem, but 2012 removes all limits. The entire world becomes the disaster. Cities fracture, mountains crumble, oceans surge across continents. Every type of natural catastrophe imaginable appears somewhere in the film's runtime. Earthquakes, supervolcanoes, megatsunamis, collapsing skylines. It's a full catalog of planetary chaos delivered with unapologetic ambition. And visually, it's often impressive. The scale of the effects remains one of the movie's most undeniable strengths. Even years after its release, certain sequences, especially the destruction of Los Angeles, still stand out as some of the most elaborate disaster imagery ever created for a blockbuster film. But spectacle alone can only carry a story so far. Beneath the breathtaking visuals, the film struggles with many of the same weaknesses that critics have pointed out in Emmerich's work for years. The characters often feel like familiar archetypes rather than complex individuals. Emotional moments lean heavily into melodrama. The science behind the catastrophe stretches credibility far beyond its breaking point. And then there's the runtime. At nearly 3 hours, the film sometimes feels as if it's trying to destroy the world multiple times over, constantly escalating the destruction in ways that eventually blur together. What begins as thrilling spectacle gradually risks turning into repetition. Still, it's important to remember what kind of movie 2012 set out to be. It was never trying to be a deeply philosophical meditation on humanity. It wasn't chasing quiet character drama or scientific realism. From the beginning, it positioned itself as something much simpler and much louder. A cinematic roller coaster. The kind of movie where audiences sit back, watch iconic landmarks collapse, and experience the thrill of seeing the impossible unfold on screen. For viewers willing to embrace that mindset, the film delivers exactly what it promises. It's enormous, it's excessive, and at times, it's gloriously ridiculous. There's even a strange charm in that excess. The movie never apologizes for its ambition. If anything, it seems determined to prove that when it comes to disaster cinema, bigger is always better. For some viewers, that ambition makes the film exhausting. For others, it's precisely what makes it entertaining. But regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, 2012 accomplishes something very few movies attempt. It stages the end of the world with such relentless commitment that the spectacle becomes impossible to ignore. And when the final shot reveals a newly reshaped Earth waiting for humanity's survivors, the film leaves us with a strangely fitting conclusion. After 2.5 hours of collapsing cities, rising oceans, and impossible escapes, the story finally pauses and asks one last question. Not about whether the world ended, but about whether anything meaningful survived the spectacle besides the destruction itself. To fully understand 2012, you have to place it within the career of the director who made it. Roland Emmerich has spent decades building a reputation as Hollywood's architect of cinematic destruction. While other filmmakers focus on superheroes, war stories, or science fiction adventures, Emmerich has repeatedly returned to one central idea: what happens when the world falls apart? His filmography reads almost like a timeline of large-scale catastrophes. Independence Day brought alien invasions crashing into global landmarks. Godzilla unleashed a towering creature through New York City. The Day After Tomorrow imagined climate disasters freezing entire continents. Each time, the pattern remained the same: massive destruction. Ordinary people caught in the middle. A small group of survivors racing against impossible odds. With 2012, Emmerich pushes that formula further than ever before. Instead of focusing on a single threat, aliens, monsters, or weather, the film unleashes the entire planet. Earthquakes fracture cities. Supervolcanoes erupt. Tsunamis erase coastlines. Even the Earth's crust begins shifting across the globe. It's not just a disaster movie, it's every disaster movie at once. In many ways, 2012 feels like Emmerich's attempt to create the ultimate entry in the genre, a film that includes every catastrophic scenario imaginable and stages them on the biggest scale possible. And the movie openly acknowledges its cinematic ancestry. You can see echoes of earlier disaster films throughout the story. The flooding compartments and sliding chaos aboard the survival vessels recall scenes from the Poseidon Adventure. Massive tidal waves swallowing cities evoke the tradition of classic catastrophe cinema from the 1970s. Even certain visual moments feel like deliberate callbacks to Emmerich's own earlier films, including the destruction of the White House, something he has now staged more than once. It's almost as if the film is paying tribute to decades of disaster storytelling while simultaneously trying to surpass it. But that ambition comes with a cost. Because while 2012 may represent the genre's most extravagant spectacle, it also exposes many of the genre's weaknesses. Disaster movies have always struggled to balance human drama with large-scale destruction. The bigger the catastrophe becomes, the harder it is for individual characters to feel significant within it. In 2012, the spectacle sometimes overwhelms everything else. The emotional stakes struggle to keep up with the visual scale. Entire civilizations collapse in the background, while the narrative focuses on a handful of characters racing through collapsing landscapes. For some viewers, this imbalance becomes frustrating. They see the movie as an example of blockbuster filmmaking prioritizing spectacle over substance. But for others, that's exactly what makes the film work. Disaster movies have always been about watching the impossible unfold. They allow audiences to experience catastrophic scenarios safely from the comfort of a theater seat. The destruction becomes a kind of cinematic thrill, terrifying in concept, but exhilarating in presentation. And few directors understand how to deliver that thrill as confidently as Roland Emmerich. Even critics who question his storytelling often acknowledge his ability to stage large-scale chaos with clarity. Unlike some action directors whose sequences become visually confusing, Emmerich usually allows audiences to see the destruction clearly, watching cities collapse piece by piece rather than hiding the spectacle behind frantic editing. In that sense, 2012 represents the culmination of his signature style. The movie may not reinvent the disaster genre, but it certainly pushes it to its absolute extreme. It asks a simple question: if you were going to make the biggest disaster movie ever created, how far would you go? Emmerich's answer is simple: destroy everything. And while that approach might not satisfy viewers looking for subtle storytelling or scientific realism, it undeniably delivers one of the most ambitious spectacles the genre has ever attempted. Whether you see it as thrilling, exhausting, ridiculous, or impressive, 2012 stands as a defining example of disaster cinema pushed to its absolute limit. By the time the credits roll on 2012, one thing becomes clear: this movie isn't really about the apocalypse, it's about our fascination with it. For centuries, humanity has imagined the end of the world in countless different ways. Ancient civilizations wrote myths about floods wiping out humanity. Religious traditions described final judgments and cosmic battles. Modern culture replaced those ideas with scientific catastrophes: asteroid impacts, climate collapse, nuclear war. But the core fascination never changed. We're drawn to stories about the end, and disaster films tap directly into that curiosity. They allow audiences to experience the unimaginable, watching the planet fall apart while remaining safely outside the danger. 2012 takes that fascination and magnifies it to an almost absurd scale. The film doesn't just hint at destruction, it shows continents fracturing, oceans swallowing cities, entire landscapes shifting as the planet itself rebels against civilization. It's apocalypse turned into a visual spectacle, something to be admired as much as feared. But there's an interesting contradiction buried inside that spectacle. Because while the film depicts one of the largest catastrophes imaginable, it also treats the apocalypse as a kind of cinematic attraction. The destruction is massive, but it's also meticulously choreographed. Buildings collapse in slow motion. Tidal waves tower over skylines like giant walls of water. Entire cities fall apart in breathtaking detail. It's terrifying in concept, yet strangely beautiful to watch. That paradox lies at the heart of disaster cinema. The same images that represent unimaginable tragedy also become thrilling entertainment. Audiences sit in dark theaters eating popcorn while watching civilizations collapse on screen. It's a strange emotional balance, horror mixed with excitement. And 2012 leans fully into that balance. It doesn't pretend that its destruction is realistic. It doesn't hide the fact that the spectacle is the real attraction. Instead, the film embraces the absurdity of its premise and delivers the biggest disaster scenario it can imagine. The result is something that sits in a peculiar space between awe and exhaustion. On one level, the movie is undeniably impressive. Few films have attempted destruction on this scale, and even fewer have executed it with such relentless ambition. The visual effects teams dismantle the planet piece by piece, creating a world where no landmark, city, or continent feels safe. On another level, the spectacle eventually raises a deeper question. After watching the world end so many times on screen, does the destruction still mean anything? Because by the time the final survivors stand on the deck of the Ark and look out over a reshaped planet, the emotional impact of the apocalypse has been replaced by something else: the recognition that the spectacle itself was the main attraction all along. The world didn't end to tell a moral story. It ended because watching it collapse was exciting. And maybe that's the strange truth behind disaster movies in general. They're not really about fear, they're about imagination. They allow us to confront the idea of global catastrophe without actually experiencing it. They let us explore the fragility of civilization while reminding us that the story will eventually end with survivors staring toward a new beginning. In 2012, that new beginning appears on the horizon as the Ark sail toward a reshaped Earth. Africa emerges as a symbolic cradle for humanity's future. The survivors step onto a planet that has been wiped clean, ready to start again. But the movie leaves one final thought lingering in the air. After everything that was destroyed, after billions of lives were lost, after the entire world collapsed, was the real purpose of the story to imagine how humanity survives? Or was it simply to show how spectacular the end of the world can look on screen? That question might be the most revealing part of the entire film. Because in the end, 2012 isn't just a disaster movie. It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest spectacle Hollywood can create is the destruction of everything we know.